December 27, 1942. The skies above Buna, New Guinea. 9 American fighters climbed through broken cloud at 18,000 feet, twin booms and twin engines catching the pale winter light of the southern hemisphere summer. Below them, a formation of Japanese Zeros and bombers is running a supply mission to a garrison that is already starving, already dying, already losing a battle that history will barely remember by name. What history will remember is what happens next in the air above it. The Americans dive. Their aircraft is unlike anything the Japanese pilots have faced in this theater, twin-boomed, liquid-cooled, heavy enough that the Zero pilots below briefly mistake it for a bomber. It is not a bomber. It is a fighter unlike any the Pacific has yet seen, and in the space of a few minutes it claims several Japanese aircraft for the loss of none of its own. That fight became legend. What came before it did not. 6 weeks earlier, over the same stretch of ocean and jungle, a different formation of these same twin-engine fighters had gone up against Zeros and come apart. Engines seized at altitude. Formations scattered. Pilots who had trained for months in Californian skies where the air was thin and cold, and forgiving discovered that the tropical Pacific punished machinery in ways no manual had prepared them for. Superchargers failed. Turbos ran hot and quit. Men who had been told they were flying the finest fighter in the American arsenal watched Zeros, a fighter 1/3 the weight of their own, turn inside them, climb away from them, and vanish before their guns could track. The reports were not published. They went into folders marked for internal review, filed alongside a growing question that Army Air Forces planners in Washington did not want asked out loud. Had they given the Pacific Theater a fighter it did not yet know how to fly? The aircraft's name was the P-38 Lightning. And the story of how it went from a machine that frightened its own pilots to a machine that Japanese aviators would come to fear more than any other Allied fighter of the war is not, in the end, a story about an airplane at all. It is a story about what an airplane costs to learn, in fuel, in hours, in dead men, before it can be used the way its designers always intended. That story starts more than a decade earlier, on a drafting table in California, and it ends over a jungle strip in Bougainville with the single most consequential fighter interception of the entire Pacific War. 15 years after the war ended, a one-eyed man in Tokyo sat down at a writing desk to finish a manuscript. His name was Saburo Sakai, and by 1957, he was one of the most famous fighter pilots to survive the Japanese Navy's air service, 64 confirmed victories, a body full of shrapnel, a right eye he had lost to an American rear gunner's bullet in August 1942, and somehow flown 400 miles home without. Sakai was writing what would become Samurai, the memoir that introduced the West to the Japanese pilot's side of the air war in the Pacific. In it, he did not just recount his own victories. He tried to explain, honestly, what it had felt like to watch the balance of the air war shift beneath his formation. A shift that had less to do with any single dogfight than with an American fighter his younger comrades had learned, by 1943 and 1944, to genuinely dread. Sakai would write, in substance, that his fellow pilots had come to treat the twin-engine American fighter differently than they treated any single-engine opponent, with a caution that bordered on respect and sometimes on fear. The truth of how that fear was earned, Sakai understood better than almost anyone alive, was not simple. It was not really about which airplane was better. It was about what happened to two air forces over 2 years, when one of them could replace its pilots and one of them could not. But in the spring of 1942, none of that had happened yet. In the spring of 1942, the Zero was still the terror of the Pacific sky, and the men who flew it had every reason to believe nothing built by Detroit or Seattle or Burbank could touch them. The Mitsubishi A6M0 had entered combat over China in 1940 and had done something no fighter of its era had managed. It combined a top speed and climb rate competitive with the best fighters in the world with a turning radius that felt, to the pilots who flew against it, almost supernatural. At Pearl Harbor, over the Philippines, over Malaya, over the Dutch East Indies, Zero pilots flying obsolete Allied aircraft into the ground compiled kill ratios that seemed, from the American and British side, almost impossible to believe. Sakai's own war during this period reads like the record of a man discovering he is very hard to kill. Flying from bases across the Dutch East Indies and later Rabaul, he downed Allied fighters and bombers with a consistency that made him, by mid-1942, one of the highest-scoring pilots in the Japanese Navy. Zero pilots wrote home, in the private letters and diaries that would surface only after the war, with a confidence that in hindsight reads almost as prophecy of its own undoing. They described Allied pilots who could not turn with them, could not climb with them, and increasingly, could not survive an engagement with them for more than a few seconds. By mid-1942, that confidence had calcified into something like doctrine. Japanese Naval Air Service planners believed the Zero's advantages were durable, even permanent. Pilot training pipelines that had once produced extraordinarily skilled aviators over years of peacetime instruction continued to assume there would be time to keep producing them at that pace. Nobody in a position of authority seriously planned for the war to become a contest of who could replace dead pilots faster. That confidence would prove to be the single most expensive assumption of the air war. The man most responsible for the Zero's brilliance, and for the flaw baked invisibly into it, was an engineer named Jiro Horikoshi. Horikoshi was in his mid-30s when the Imperial Japanese Navy handed Mitsubishi a set of requirements for a new carrier fighter, so demanding that other manufacturers considered them essentially impossible to meet simultaneously. Extreme range, exceptional maneuverability, a rate of climb to rival any fighter flying, and a top speed competitive with the best in the world. All from an engine considerably less powerful than what American and European designers had to work with. Horikoshi's solution was, in its way, a work of genius. He achieved the Zero's extraordinary performance largely through weight. He and his team shaved mass everywhere they legally and structurally could, using a newly developed extralight aluminum alloy, thinning the airframe, and, most consequentially, leaving out almost everything that added protection without adding performance. The Zero flew without self-sealing fuel tanks. It flew with minimal armor plating behind the pilot's seat. Post-war, Horikoshi would describe the philosophy in terms that amounted to an explicit trade. Every kilogram spent on protecting the airplane, and the man inside it was a kilogram not spent on the speed, range, and agility that would, in the doctrine of the time, keep that airplane from ever being hit in the first place. It was a bet that the best defense was simply never being caught. For the first year of the war, against opponents who could rarely catch the Zero even when they wanted to, that bet paid off spectacularly. It would not always be a war against those opponents. The compromise Horikoshi had built into his masterpiece was patient. It would wait for an enemy fighter that did not need to dogfight a Zero to kill it, an enemy that only needed to catch one once, with a burst of concentrated firepower, and let physics do the rest. Half a world away and roughly 2 years earlier, a very different kind of airplane had been born from a very different set of assumptions. In 1937, the U.S. Army Air Corps issued a requirement that sounded, on paper, almost as contradictory as the Zero's. A fighter capable of intercepting enemy bombers at high altitude, at speeds well over 350 miles per hour, with heavy firepower and long-range specifications that no single-engine, single-seat fighter of the era could plausibly deliver. Lockheed's chief engineer, a soft-spoken, exacting Michigan-born designer named Clarence Kelly Johnson, answered with something radical: 2 engines, mounted in slim booms on either side of a central pilot's nacelle, joined by a single wing and tail assembly. It was an unconventional silhouette that would earn the aircraft its Japanese nickname. Pilots and ground crews across the Pacific would come to call it, roughly, 2 planes, 1 pilot, a description of its twin-boom shape as much as a grudging acknowledgement of what it could do. Johnson's design, designated the XB-38, first flew in January 1939, piloted by Lieutenant Benjamin Kelsey. On its very first cross-country flight attempt from California to New York, the prototype set a transcontinental speed record before crashing short of the runway at Mitchell Field, a fitting, almost cruel preview of the aircraft's whole early career. Brilliant, and not quite ready. The P-38 delivered on Johnson's ambitious specifications, and then some. It could outclimb, outrun, and outdive nearly anything else flying at the start of the war. It carried a nose-mounted battery of 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20 cannon clustered together in the fuselage, rather than spread across a wing, which meant its fire converged at a single point, rather than a pattern devastatingly accurate for a pilot who could hold his aim for even a second or two. It had range that, with external tanks, dwarfed nearly every single-engine fighter on either side. It also had a fatal quirk that killed men before it ever met a Japanese pilot. In high-speed dives, the P-38's thick wing generated a shockwave effect, compressibility, that could lock the control yoke and send the aircraft into an uncontrollable dive from which many pilots could not recover. On November 4, 1938, Lockheed test pilot Ralph Verdon was killed testing dive recovery techniques in an early Lightning prototype, one of several fatal accidents that would plague the type's development before engineers worked out dive flaps and recovery procedures that made the problem survivable, if never entirely eliminated. The airplane that would terrify Japanese pilots by 1944 had, in its own infancy, terrified the Americans flying it first. Even after those problems were understood, the Lightning nearly never got the chance to prove itself where it mattered most. Army Air Force's planners in 1941 and early 1942 were consumed by the priority of building a bomber force and defending the European and North African fronts. The complex, expensive, twin-engine Lightning was, for a time, treated as a niche interceptor rather than the war-winning long-range fighter it would become. Some early tactical thinking misjudged its strengths entirely, attempting to use it in close-turning dogfights against nimbler opponents, precisely the kind of fight in which its size and weight worked against it. It took an aggressive, outspoken general in the Southwest Pacific to see what the airplane could actually do. General George Kenney, given command of 5th Air Force in mid-1942, pushed hard and repeatedly for more P-38s to be sent to New Guinea, recognizing that its combination of range, firepower, and diving speed was precisely what his theater, vast distances, primitive airfields, an enemy fighter that could outturn anything the Allies presently had actually needed. The Lightning, in other words, did not arrive in the Pacific because someone had designed it for that fight. It arrived because a theater commander was desperate enough to gamble on an airplane still working out its own growing pains, and threw it at the most demanding air war in the world with barely any time to adapt. The squadrons that received the first Lightnings in the Pacific in the second half of 1942 were, by any honest account, unready. Pilots transitioning from single-engine trainers had to learn twin-engine handling, complex turbo supercharger management, and long-range navigation over open ocean, often with only a fraction of the flight hours their commanders would have liked, on a timeline dictated by the emergency in the theater rather than a training syllabus. Ground crews unfamiliar with the aircraft's temperamental engines struggled with maintenance in the punishing heat and humidity of tropical airstrips carved out of jungle. The strategic picture they were dropped into was brutal. New Guinea in late 1942 was the hinge of the entire Southwest Pacific campaign. If Japanese forces took Port Moresby, Australia itself lay dangerously exposed. Every fighter squadron sent north went in under strength, undersupplied, and under enormous pressure to produce results immediately, with no room for a gentle learning curve. That learning curve came anyway, and it was ugly. In several of the Lightning's earliest engagements over New Guinea and the surrounding waters in the second half of 1942, American pilots discovered the hard way that raw performance numbers on a specification sheet do not win a dogfight by themselves. Zero pilots, combat-hardened veterans by this point in the war, men with hundreds of hours and, in some cases, years of prior combat experience in China, repeatedly lured inexperienced Lightning pilots into turning fights, the one kind of engagement in which the heavier American aircraft was at its worst. Formations broke down. Wingmen lost each other in the chaos. Aircraft were lost not to any single dramatic flaw in the machine, but to the simple, unglamorous mismatch between veteran pilots and green ones, regardless of what either side was flying. Mechanical failures compounded the losses. At high altitude and in tropical heat, engines that performed flawlessly in test conditions back home ran hot, lost power, and in a number of documented cases failed outright, sometimes at the worst possible moment, mid-turn, mid-climb, mid-fight. Squadron reports from this period, when they mentioned these failures at all, did so in the flat, procedural language of aircraft loss paperwork rather than the language of institutional alarm. And that, in its own way, was the more damning fact. Nobody wanted to write, in a report that might reach Washington, that the most expensive fighter in the American inventory might not yet be ready for the war it had been sent to fight. The squadron commanders who lived through those first engagements did so largely in silence. There was no vindication waiting for them at the end of a bad week. There was only the next mission, and the one after that, flown in an airplane that was still, in the fall of 1942, more promise than proven weapon. Some of the men who led those first, ragged Lightning formations into combat would not live to see the aircraft become the terror of Japanese pilots that it was destined to become. They died, or were reassigned, or simply faded from the record, in the unglamorous middle chapters of a story that would later be remembered only for its ending. On the other side of the front line, Japanese High Command received its own version of these early reports, accounts from Zero pilots describing an unusual twin-engine American fighter that could be beaten reliably if you simply forced it to turn. Some of these accounts were accurate. Many were inflated, filtered through the same institutional pressures that inflate victory claims in every air force in every war, pilots reporting damage as a kill, two pilots independently claiming the same downed aircraft, adrenaline and combat chaos compressing a confusing few seconds into a confident after-action report. The overclaiming did real damage, but the deeper failure was institutional rather than individual. A small number of more cautious Japanese officers, men who had studied American industrial capacity, who understood in the abstract what it meant that the United States could build fighters and train pilots at a scale Japan structurally could not match, raised early warnings that the war could not be won simply by producing more spectacular kill ratios in 1942. Those warnings were not, by and large, wrong. They were also not, by and large, listened to. An officer corps that had spent a decade absorbing victory after victory, first in China and then across the opening months of the Pacific War, had built an institutional culture that rewarded confidence and treated caution as something close to defeatism. It was an institution that had, in the most literal sense, stopped listening to information that contradicted what it had already decided to believe. That blindness bought the Americans something more valuable than any single engagement: time. And time, on the American side of the Pacific in late 1942 and early 1943, was being spent doing something the Japanese command structure was not doing nearly aggressively enough: working out, methodically, exactly how to beat the airplane that kept beating them. The tactical answer, once American pilots stopped trying to outturn the Zero and started using the P-38 the way Kelly Johnson had actually designed it to fight, was almost mathematical in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. The Lightning's advantages were speed, altitude performance, structural strength in a dive, and concentrated, converging firepower. A Zero's advantage was maneuverability at moderate to low speed. The tactic that neutralized that advantage entirely was to never let a fight slow down to a speed where the Zero's turn radius mattered. Dive from altitude. Make one firing pass at high speed, using the Lightning's nose-mounted guns to put a devastating, concentrated burst into a target for a fraction of a second. Then use the same diving speed to zoom back up to altitude, out of range, before the Zero could turn to follow, because at the speeds a diving Lightning could sustain, an unarmored Zero simply could not keep up, and its structurally lighter airframe made high-speed dives and hard maneuvers genuinely dangerous for the pilot attempting to follow. American pilots came to call it, informally, the boom and zoom. It sounds almost too simple to have been the tactical revolution it actually was. But it inverted the entire logic of the fight. Every advantage Horikoshi had built into the Zero, its lightness, its turning radius, its climb, became irrelevant if the American pilot simply refused to engage on those terms. And every liability the Lightning carried into a slow, turning dogfight became irrelevant if the American pilot never let the fight slow down in the first place. No single person invented this approach in a vacuum. It emerged, as most effective wartime doctrine does, from dozens of pilots independently reaching similar conclusions after near-death experiences, then comparing notes in ready rooms and mess tents across the theater. But it was pilots like a young Wisconsin farm boy named Richard Bong, flying with 5th Air Force Squadrons in New Guinea beginning in late 1942, who mastered the technique with a consistency that turned it from a survival tactic into a killing method. Bong was 23 years old when he arrived in the theater, a quiet, almost shy young man who had grown up hunting in the woods around Poplar, Wisconsin, and who approached aerial combat with the same patient, disciplined marksmanship. He did not chase Zeros into turns. He dove, fired in short, precise bursts from close range, and climbed away over and over, engagement after engagement, methodically building toward a score that would eventually make him the highest-scoring American fighter pilot of the entire war. The men who had led the Lightning's first, unglamorous combats over New Guinea in 1942 mostly did not live to see this vindication play out. Some were killed in the very engagements that exposed the aircraft's early weaknesses. Others were rotated out, reassigned, or simply lost to the churn of a theater that consumed commanders as readily as it consumed aircraft. History does not record most of their names with any prominence, because history, as a rule, remembers the pilots who scored the victories the doctrine eventually made possible, not the ones who paid the price of figuring the doctrine out. It is one of the quieter injustices of air war history that the men who make an aircraft's later success possible are so rarely alive to be thanked for it. By 1943, 5th Air Force's P-38 squadrons were no longer the unproven, accident-prone units of the previous year. They were becoming one of the most effective fighter forces in the Pacific, and their reputation among Japanese pilots was changing with a speed that the men flying against them could feel even before headquarters statistics caught up with it. The campaign widened. More squadrons converted to the Lightning across 1943 as production accelerated, and pilots trained specifically in the tactics that had proven themselves in combat, rather than discovering them the hard way. Bong's score climbed steadily, methodically, month after month. Alongside him rose a very different kind of pilot, Thomas McGuire, a Georgia-born aviator whose personality was, by most accounts from those who served with him, almost the inverse of Bong's quiet reserve. McGuire was aggressive, intensely competitive, and openly ambitious about becoming the top-scoring American ace of the war, a rivalry with Bong that both men and their squadron mates were well aware of, and that the press, when it caught wind of it late in the war, covered with evident relish. McGuire's combat record was extraordinary. He would finish the war as the second highest-scoring American ace in history, with 38 confirmed victories, most of them flying the same diving, high-speed tactics that had made Bong's reputation. McGuire's aggression, though, was also his defining risk. Pilots who flew with him described a man who pushed the edges of what the aircraft and the tactics could safely do, chasing kills in situations more cautious pilots would have declined. It was a trait that built one of the most impressive combat records of the war. It would also, eventually, kill him. Across the front line, the same widening of the air war was being felt very differently. Saburo Sakai, recovering through much of 1943 from the wound that had cost him his eye, kept detailed private observations, later folded into his post-war writing, about a shift he could feel happening in the character of the air war even from a hospital bed and a training assignment far from the front. Reports reaching him from pilots still flying combat described American fighters, increasingly identified specifically as the twin-engine Lightning, engaging on terms the Zero pilots could no longer dictate. Where earlier in the war, a skilled Japanese pilot could reasonably expect to draw an American fighter into a turning fight and win it, now the Americans simply refused the invitation. Sakai would later write, in substance, that this refusal, more than any single technical superiority, was what began to unsettle even veteran Japanese pilots. An enemy that would not fight you on your terms was, in its own way, more frightening than one that fought and lost. It is worth pausing here on a piece of the legend that does not hold up cleanly to scrutiny, because a channel built on this rivalry owes its audience the uncomfortable version of history along with the inspiring one. American ace claims throughout the Pacific War, including many credited to P-38 pilots, were subject to the same overclaiming problems that plagued every air force in every theater of the Second World War. Post-war cross-referencing against Japanese loss records has shown that confirmed American victory totals, including some credited to well-known aces, were sometimes higher than the number of Japanese aircraft actually lost in the corresponding engagements. The result of multiple pilots claiming the same target in the chaos of a multi-aircraft fight, misidentification of aircraft type under combat stress, and the honest difficulty of confirming a kill from a cockpit moving at several hundred miles per hour. This is not a Japanese-only phenomenon, and Zero pilots' own claims suffered from identical distortions. It does not diminish the extraordinary skill or courage involved in these engagements. It does mean that the clean, precise kill total so often quoted, Bong's 40, McGuire's 38, should be understood as the best available historical estimate rather than an exact, unimpeachable ledger. The myth wants clean numbers. The historical record, honestly examined, rarely provides them. None of that overclaiming, however it complicated the record, changed the deeper mathematics that were quietly deciding the outcome of the entire air war. Mathematics that had nothing to do with any single dogfight, and everything to do with what was happening in flight schools and factories thousands of miles from the front. Here is the reveal the whole story has been building toward, and it is not a story about which fighter was better. By 1943 and accelerating through 1944, the United States was training new fighter pilots at a scale and to a standard that Japan's air services simply could not match, structurally could not match, no matter how skilled any individual Japanese pilot remained. American cadets moved through a training pipeline that, by the middle of the war, routinely delivered several hundred flight hours before a pilot ever saw combat. Japan's pre-war training standard had once been extraordinary. Pilots like Sakai had entered combat with exceptional skill built over years of peacetime instruction. But that system was built for a small, elite force fighting a short war. It was never designed to replace pilots at the rate the Pacific War, particularly after the grinding attrition of the Solomons and New Guinea campaigns, actually demanded. As Japan's most experienced pilots were killed faster than the pre-war training pipeline could replace them, the Air Service was forced to shorten training programs dramatically just to keep cockpits filled, sometimes to a fraction of the hours a pre-war cadet would have received. The result was an Air Force that, by 1944, was still occasionally producing brilliant individual pilots, but was, on average, sending increasingly undertrained aviators into cockpits against an American opponent whose training pipeline was, if anything, still improving. Industrial capacity told the same story from a different angle. American aircraft production during the war years dwarfed Japan's by a margin that made individual technical advantages, however real, almost beside the point in the aggregate. Lockheed alone would build roughly 10,000 P-38s across the war. Losses that would have crippled a smaller air force were, for the Americans, simply absorbed and replaced, aircraft and pilots both, at a pace Japan's shipyards, factories, and flight schools could never come close to matching. This is the part of the story documentaries too often skip past in favor of the more cinematic dogfights. The P-38 did not become the fighter Japanese pilots feared most purely because Kelly Johnson had designed a faster, better-armed airplane, though he had. It became that fighter because the United States could put it in the air, again and again, flown by pilots with more training and backed by a supply chain that never truly ran dry, against an opponent whose best pilots were dying faster than they could conceivably be replaced. The airplane won the myth. The training pipeline and the factory floor won the war. Sakai understood this by the war's end better than almost any Japanese pilot who survived it, and it is precisely the unglamorous, invisible nature of that truth that makes it worth saying plainly, out loud, rather than letting the myth of the machine stand unchallenged. There is one more thread in this story that connects it to a name far more famous than any fighter pilot's. A connection so unlikely that if it were invented for a screenplay, audiences would call it implausible. In the spring and summer of 1944, Charles Lindbergh, the man who had flown the Atlantic solo in 1927, and whose pre-war isolationist politics had made him a deeply controversial figure by the time the United States entered the war, traveled to the Pacific Theater as a civilian technical consultant for Lockheed and United Aircraft, officially there to study fighter performance and fuel efficiency. Unofficially, eager to fly combat himself despite holding no military commission. What Lindbergh brought to 5th Air Force's P-38 squadrons was not glamour. It was fuel management technique, a set of engine leaning and cruise control procedures, refined from his own long-distance flying experience, that dramatically extended the Lightning's already impressive range, allowing missions that had previously been considered fuel impossible. Pilots who adopted Lindbergh's techniques found themselves able to reach targets and return from them, with margins that reshaped what 5th Air Force could attempt. On July 28, 1944, flying an unofficial combat sortie he technically had no authorization to fly, Lindbergh engaged and shot down a Japanese aircraft over Saram, the only air-to-air victory of his life, credited to a 52-year-old civilian instructor flying an airplane he had never been trained by the military to fight in at all. It is one of the strangest footnotes of the entire Pacific Air War, and it is entirely true. As American training and production advantages compounded through 1944, the losing side's response followed a pattern that would recur, with grim consistency, whenever a modern Air Force ran out of skilled pilots faster than it could produce new ones. Escalation toward tactics that substituted willingness to die for the training and machinery it no longer had in sufficient supply. The most extreme expression of that logic arrived in October 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when Japanese Navy Captain Motoharu Okamura organized the first deliberate kamikaze, suicide attacks, arguing explicitly to his superiors that a single bomb-laden aircraft, deliberately crashed into an American ship by a pilot with only minimal training, could inflict far more damage than that same undertrained pilot could hope to achieve in conventional air combat against increasingly skilled, increasingly better-equipped American fighter opposition. It was, in its own horrifying way, a rational response to an irrational math problem. Japan could no longer produce pilots capable of winning conventional engagements, so it began producing pilots whose missions did not require them to survive the engagement at all. P-38 squadrons, among other American fighter units, would spend the war's final year flying combat air patrols, specifically tasked with intercepting kamikaze formations before they reached the fleet. The same diving, high-speed tactics that had once been used to kill Zeros in open-air combat, repurposed to protect ships from pilots who were no longer trying to win a dogfight, only to complete one final flight. The war's final year also brought loss much closer to the story's central figures. On January 7, 1945, over Negros Island in the Philippines, Thomas Maguire led a flight of 4 P-38s on a mission to protect a fellow pilot who had been shot down. Encountering a lone Japanese fighter at low altitude, Maguire, flying with external fuel tanks still attached, at an altitude and airspeed that left almost no margin for his own established rule against turning hard under those exact conditions, broke that rule to help a squadron mate under attack. His aircraft snap-rolled and crashed. He was 39 victories short of Bong's total, killed instantly at the age of 24, and would be awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for the mission on which he died, a mission flown in direct violation of a safety principle he himself had taught to younger pilots. Richard Bong did not die in combat at all, a fact that carries its own quiet irony. Rotated home in early 1945 as America's top-scoring ace of the war, with 40 confirmed victories, Bong was assigned to test fly the P-80 Shooting Star, the Army Air Force's first operational jet fighter. On August 6, 1945, the same day the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a coincidence of timing that briefly kept his death out of the day's headlines, Bong was killed when his P-80's fuel pump failed on takeoff near Burbank, California. The most successful fighter pilot in American history survived roughly 200 combat missions against Japan's best pilots, only to die in a training accident at home. 4 days before the war he had spent 3 years fighting finally ended. The single most consequential P-38 mission of the entire war, meanwhile, had already been flown nearly 2 years earlier, and it belongs at the center of any honest account of why Japanese pilots came to fear this aircraft above all others, not because of a dogfight, but because of an assassination flown at the very edge of the airplane's range. American codebreakers, having cracked elements of the Japanese naval code, learned in April 1943 that Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Combined Fleet, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, and by far the most respected and feared strategic mind in the Japanese Navy, would be flying a precisely timed inspection tour to Bougainville on April 18th. Only the P-38, with its exceptional range extended further with drop tanks, could plausibly fly the roughly 1,000-mile round trip required to intercept him. Major John Mitchell planned and led an 18-aircraft mission that required almost unimaginably precise long-range, low-altitude navigation over open ocean, timed to arrive at an exact interception point within a minute of Yamamoto's own scheduled arrival, with no room for radio communication that might alert Japanese air defenses. Mitchell's navigation held. The Lightnings arrived almost exactly on schedule, climbed to meet Yamamoto's 2 escorted bombers, and in the ensuing brief engagement, both Japanese bombers were shot down. Yamamoto was killed. Credit for the specific kill went, in the post-war record, primarily to 2 pilots, Rex Barber and Thomas Lanphier, and the dispute over which of them actually fired the fatal burst became one of the longest-running and most bitter controversies of the entire Pacific Air War, a disagreement that consumed decades of post-war investigation, competing eyewitness accounts, and a rivalry between the 2 men and their supporters that lasted essentially the rest of their lives, without ever being definitively resolved. It is a small, human, unglamorous coda to an operation of enormous strategic consequence, a reminder that even the most celebrated missions of the war were flown and remembered by men who were fallible, competitive, and sometimes simply wrong about their own role in history. Yamamoto's death did not, by itself, end the war, but it removed, permanently, the one Japanese naval commander whose strategic judgment his own government most trusted, at a moment when that judgment was desperately needed, and it did so through a mission that only the P-38's extraordinary range made possible at all. No other American fighter of 1943 could have flown it. By the war's final year, the stronghold that had once represented Japan's dominant air power in the Southwest Pacific, Rabaul, the massive fortified base that had launched so many of the raids Sakai and his comrades had once flown with such confidence, was not stormed or overrun by American ground forces at all. It was simply bypassed and starved. Its aircraft, fuel, and above all its trained pilots consumed faster than they could be replaced, until it ceased to function as an offensive threat and was left to wither, isolated, behind advancing American lines. It fell, in the final accounting, not to superior firepower delivered in a single decisive battle, but to the same invisible arithmetic that had been deciding the outcome since 1943, attrition, training, and industrial capacity, hollowing out a base that no enemy force ever needed to physically capture. The individual fates of the men at the center of this story closed out, in the years that followed, with the mixture of triumph and quiet loss that seems to characterize almost every serious account of this war. Richard Bong died August 6, 1945, age 24, in a test flight accident near Burbank, 4 days before Japan's surrender. Thomas Maguire died January 7, 1945, age 24, over Negros Island, breaking his own combat rule to save a squadron mate, and received the Medal of Honor posthumously. Jiro Horikoshi survived the war, later reflecting publicly and at length on the design compromises built into the Zero, and went on to a long post-war career in Japanese aviation and aerospace engineering, dying in 1982. Kelly Johnson survived the war and went on to found and lead Lockheed's legendary Skunk Works, designing the U-2 spy plane and the SR-71 Blackbird, becoming arguably the most influential aircraft designer of the entire 20th century before his death in 1990. Saburo Sakai survived the war despite his wound, never regained full vision in his damaged eye, refused to fly combat again in a kamikaze role despite pressure to do so late in the war, and became, through his memoir and decades of post-war reconciliation work with American veterans, one of the most internationally recognized Japanese airmen of his generation, dying in 2000 at the age of 84 while attending a dinner with former American adversaries. A detail that reads almost too poetically neat to be true, and is nonetheless accurate. John Mitchell survived the war, remained in the Air Force, and lived until 1990, spending much of his later life engaged in the long, unresolved dispute over credit for the Yamamoto mission he had planned and led. Charles Lindbergh returned from the Pacific to a controversial but gradually rehabilitated public life, remaining involved in aviation and conservation until his death in 1974. Rex Barber and Thomas Lanphier both survived the war and lived into old age, each maintaining until his death that he alone had fired the shots that killed Yamamoto, a disagreement neither man ever abandoned. The P-38 Lightning itself remained in production until 1945, with roughly 10,000 built across the war, and it holds a distinction few other American fighters of the conflict can claim. It was in continuous frontline production and combat service in every theater the United States fought in, from the deserts of North Africa to the skies over Germany to the vast distances of the Pacific, longer than almost any other American fighter type of the war. It shot down more Japanese aircraft than any other Army Air Forces fighter in the Pacific theater. Its twin-boom silhouette, born from Kelly Johnson's willingness to solve an apparently impossible specification with an unconventional answer, would echo forward into the design language of Lockheed's post-war jets, including the very Skunk Works aircraft Johnson would go on to build. What is left, after the individual names have been accounted for, is the larger and more uncomfortable lesson the whole story was built to reach. Japan's post-war industrial rise, in the decades after 1945, would eventually produce some of the most technically refined manufacturing and engineering culture on Earth. A nation that had once believed elite craftsmanship and individual skill could substitute for industrial scale would spend the following half-century learning, in peacetime, the exact lesson its Air Force had been unable to absorb in wartime. That scale, training, and system design determine outcomes over time far more reliably than any single brilliant piece of individual engineering or individual skill, however extraordinary. It is the same lesson, learned twice, in two very different kinds of contest. Somewhere in that lesson is the honest answer to the question this story opened with. Japanese pilots by 1944 had learned to fear the P-38 Lightning more than any other Allied fighter, not simply because of its speed, or its range, or the concentrated fire of its nose-mounted guns, though all of that was real and all of it mattered. They feared it because, by the time it arrived over their formations in numbers, it represented something no individual pilot's skill could outfly. An enemy that could lose the early rounds, learn from losing them, and keep sending better-trained pilots in better-supplied aircraft until the arithmetic simply ran out. 9 American fighters climbed through the cloud above Buna in December of 1942, flying a machine that had, only weeks before, nearly failed the men who flew it. By the time the war ended, that same machine's shadow was enough to change what a formation of Japanese pilots decided to do the moment they saw its twin booms on the horizon. That was never really about the airplane. It was about everything standing behind it.